Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and this is the Keto Made Simple podcast.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Eric Westman here. And from time to time, it's my pleasure to interview the people who I think are movers and shakers in the low-carb world. Often they're doctors, but in this case, this is a mover and a shaker. And you're not a doctor, Dave Feldman, are you?
No, I'm certainly not.
or a doctor of I don't know, of learning how to do research on your own. Anyway, please explain who you are, your background, and as if someone had never heard of you before.
Yes, so I'm Dave Feldman. I'm actually originally a software engineer and have been pretty much my entire life. In fact, I've had very little interest beyond the surface curiosity in sort of science, nutrition, and medicine overall until about 9 years ago. And you know this story pretty well, Eric, but for those who haven't heard of me before, what happened was I'd gone on a ketogenic diet, and I was doing so in order to avoid developing full-blown type 2 diabetes. I had read in some forums that reducing carbohydrates reduces glucose, and hey, diabetes is ultimately a disease of dysregulation of glucose. So why not just, take out the carbs? I know it's kind of a revolutionary thought these days, but that's what I was going with. So I brought down my carbohydrates, and lo and behold, I just had a new lease on life. I felt like I was experiencing an entirely new phase. And at the time, I was training for running, and I was hitting new personal records. I had lost weight that I wasn't even trying to lose and looked more like I did when I was going into college. And just everything seemed to be better. And then about 7 months later, I get my blood work. I'm excited to get my blood work because I know all my numbers are probably going to be the best ever. And pretty much all of them were except for one. Cholesterol. My total and LDL cholesterol had shot through the roof. They actually doubled. Before that point, it was fairly average levels of cholesterol. I had maybe about 120, 130 LDL, which is like right in the middle average for someone my age. And no, they had shot up substantially. My LDL had gone to like 240, 250. Now I'm going to be kind of briefing it up a little bit, but from there, as you know, I became quite obsessed. As an engineer, I wanted to understand the why. Why was this happening?
Well, may I ask, what happened to the triglyceride and HDL?
Oh, yes. Well, my triglycerides went down. My HDL went up.
Oh, right. So just to reassure people who are watching, who've had a certain change in the cholesterol pattern like that, that is probably the most, well, do we know what percentage of people have elevated LDLs? On average, in a lot of studies, it's there's no change on average, which means some go up, some go down. Do you have a good sense of how many folks who do a keto diet might have an elevated LDL?
Well, the me of 2024 can give you a very succinct answer. The me back then of 2015, I had no idea.
Yeah.
But I heard it was super rare. In fact, the same forums I was going to that was suggesting I'd go low carb would say, oh, this happens to almost nobody, except maybe a few people, super rare. And at that time, there was nowhere to go. There was no literature on it.
Well, then why didn't you just stop at didn't your doctor tell you to get off that crazy diet?
I was telling myself to get off that crazy diet. I remember this Subway sandwich I was looking at the day after I'd gotten my blood work, because I was very scared. I was very upset. And spoiler alert, there's not a point in this story where I'm completely certain LDL is irrelevant. So just a heads up. But I will say this, because of just how high it went, I thought, okay, I have to get off keto. It's not working. My dad and my sister had adopted the diet at the same time, but their cholesterol hardly moved. So here I'm looking at my Subway sandwich the next morning. I'm like eating a few bites of it. And I think this is crazy. I've been doing so well on keto. There's just got to be more to this story. And so I kind of became a little depressed, frankly, and started to try to learn everything I could about lipidology. As I just mentioned, I wasn't that much into science or nutrition and so forth. And so I had to learn from scratch. But what I found was that it looked a lot like something I work on in software engineering. It looked like a network. The system that moves cholesterol around in our body, it's a network. It's a network of different packets, if you will, that contain the cholesterol, but also contain the fat we're fueled by. And I believe to this day that that was perhaps one of the most vital clues. So the next piece of this is I finally got a second blood test, sort of a second opinion, like maybe there was an error in that first test. But this was after 2 weeks of being depressed, and so my appetite had gone way down. And since my appetite had gone way down, then the amount of fat I was eating had gone way down, which includes saturated fat, and the amount of cholesterol I was consuming went way down. So, hey, if those were the drivers of this super high level of LDL cholesterol, this was kind of a natural experiment, right? Like if I'm eating less of those components that are driving up my LDL cholesterol, then, maybe it would go back down again, but it didn't. It went up. And at that point, there's more to the story.
In medical training, one of the things that just didn't sit right with me was the fact that if you go on a low cholesterol diet, your liver just makes more cholesterol.
Right.
So the kind of routine teaching didn't sit well, which kind of made me open to the idea that there might be something else going on. But then, so you didn't just stop doing this.
No. In fact, that was the second test I just now mentioned. At that point, I really dedicated pretty much all of my time to tracking my food and tracking my blood work. And I started getting a lot of blood work. By the time I went...
Have you counted how many cholesterol tests you've done so far?
I have. Well, it's somewhere between 140 and 150 blood draws. Now, these are blood draws, as in I've literally, gone to a LabCorp and gotten them drawn. As far as actual cholesterol lipid tests, including home devices such as such as a PTS diagnostics, it's probably somewhere close to 800 or 900, something in that neighborhood. Because
I'll never forget. Do you remember what year we were on the low carb cruise together?
I think it was 2017.
So the year is a blur to me, but you came up to me with reams. I mean, like a stack of data of your blood tests, your cholesterol tests, and you showed me how it changed through the course of the day.
Yeah,
and a lot. And I I'm a traditionally trained internal medicine doctor, and I thought, well, that's unusual that it would go up and down so much throughout the day. We're not taught that. And then I looked at you and I said, why are you doing this? But it's interesting, and keep doing it. Or just, at least I didn't tell you, or maybe if I said you're crazy, you would have done it even more. But it was very interesting to see someone take on what had been settled science. I mean, I was taught you check the cholesterol level and you can make a decision to put someone on a medicine for life based on one test.
Yeah. And then indeed, that's the conversations I was having with my doctor at the time. And the moment I'd gotten that second test, I was going back to my doctor. I was saying, well, hold it. I know what you've told me, and that's what I've also read in the literature, but I don't think it's true. At a minimum, I think there's a different context here. That if you're predominantly powered by fat, then we're watching these changes in the trafficking of that fat as shown in the cholesterol. And that, I would contend, has seemed to be the case to this day. That's what all those experiments were for. I needed to very rapidly, it's not good enough to just get a single snapshot, especially months or even a year apart. You learn more by getting a rapid succession of shots.
So how much can the blood cholesterol, let's say cholesterol, LDL, go up and down through the course of a day? If I took it.
Yeah, I should show you. You know, it's funny if we can edit this part. I'll actually pull up. I kind of want to share this with you real quick. 1 second.
But I seem to remember, I mean, it's 50 to 100 points.
Yeah,
That this would be a decision of medicine or no medicine, you know, having a level go up and down.
So right now I'm looking at over the course of the day, an experiment that I did in 2021, where I was getting my lipids taken 6 times a day. I got it when I woke up. I got it at 7 a.m., 9 a.m., 2 p.m., 7 p.m., and then one last time at 10 p.m. And I was comparing the exact same diet in 2 different phases. In phase 1, it was eating 3 meals over about 10 hours. In the second, it was eating 3 meals in about 4.5 hours. So basically, it was an eating window experiment. And you can see by this graph that all of the lipid metrics get impacted. But the Friedwald LDL cholesterol, which is to say the LDL cholesterol, sorry, let me dismiss.
One.
Yeah, we're have to do an edit here. 1 second.
I don't see anything on the screen if you're trying to show it. I might have that turned off. I don't know.
No worries. Okay. Yeah, let me I'll just restate that again. So you can see in these, do you want me to share my screen? That might actually be even better.
Well, if you can.
1 second.
Or you could just describe what you're looking at.
Share. Oh, you have to give me permission to share.
Oh, let's see. Where do I do that?
It's the security button. Don't worry, this will be worth it. You'll like this.
Security and hide share screen. Allow participants to share screen.
Yep. All right. So we're going to go to, there we go. All right. So we're now looking at this graph. Let me tell you what you're looking at. The blue line is 10.5-hour eating window, and the orange line is a 4.5-hour eating window. And this is an average. Each phase was 5 days long, and this is an average of the last 3 days for each of their respective phases.
Okay.
And as you can see, my glucose seems to generally track pretty close. The ketones, I'm not surprised they diverge because the 4.5-hour eating window is close to noonish. But here's where it gets interesting. Notice how total cholesterol rises much higher before coming back down in the 4.5-hour eating window. The reason this is important is because these are identical diets. The only difference is that one is compressed in less time, the 4.5-hour eating window. But I'm not only eating exactly the same things, I'm getting the same amount of exercise in each of these phases. I'm getting the same amount of sleep. Everything is synced up so that we can see this key difference. So to answer your question, not only are these changing over the course of the day, but look just how much they diverge even on the same diet based on the timing of when I'm consuming my food.
Well, let this be a great warning or a recapitulation. You want to do a fasting lipid panel.
Exactly.
For sure. But look at how after the course of the day, it might go up, 40 points, 50 points. But this is over the course of the day, and yet we assume this is a static number, and doctors, and that we make a decision of risk, but on that first number. But how many times now do doctors say, "Oh, it doesn't matter if you're fasting"? right?
Particularly,
Total cholesterol. How about the LDL, right? Because everyone focuses on the LDL down the bottom, right? So
the LDL here, yeah.
This just, can you explain? So it would go up again, maybe 50 points and down, 60 points through the course of a day.
Right. So the peak
we're not taught this. We're not taught this.
Right. But I want to draw attention to this too. So take triglycerides.
Yeah.
So this is something I hear over and over again. People coming into the groups and they say, I thought I might have the triad, but it turns out I have super high levels of triglycerides. The very first question that everyone in the group asks, and this includes me, is, wait a second, when did you get your blood drawn? And we're like, oh, well, I was visiting the doctor's office in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
Did you eat recently? Did you eat a high-fat diet since you literally are on a low-carb diet? Well, yes. Well, then you quite literally installed triglycerides into your bloodstream, because that's what you're packaging when you're putting together fat from your meal and putting it into your bloodstream. So yes, if there's anything you should absolutely take from these 7 graphs that I have in front of you, is that there absolutely is a very dynamic, just hour to hour level with our lipids, especially if we're powered by fat.
Well, now you could argue, and I think I did at first, is, well, we simplify it. We just use the fasting level, and so many studies have shown that if you have a fasting elevated cholesterol level, your risk is up, and if you treat it with a drug, the risk goes down. Were you less confident in that sort of teaching after doing this?
That you need to be fasted? I'm sorry, say that again.
Well, no. Were you less confident with it into the whole cholesterol idea? Because this variability is not something that we're taught about.
Correct. Yes, that was part of what got me more and more interested. As I'm sure you've watched in real time online, there are many different, I think, well-intentioned folks, especially doctors, but also lipid researchers, who would insist, hey, wait a sec, this has already been studied. This is, there's already really amazing labs that are out there. All of the work has been done, so that there's not much mystery left on cholesterol dynamics and the people who are metabolically healthy. And I, with every ounce of humility I can put forth, I would say, I really don't feel as though the level of curiosity seems to be here for what we're trying to bring forward to you. If you're on a ketogenic diet and you're powered by fat, there seems to be this emerging context that we should be studying. We absolutely should. But that comes to the next part of my life that was a bit more challenging.
Well, but it's kind of to recapitulate this section. You did a keto diet, felt great, everything got better, but the LDL. And I hear this all the time, and it wasn't until 25 years into this that I finally heard myself say this enough that I said, well, gosh, maybe it should be, maybe it's good that the LDL goes up because everything else got better. Maybe we have the wrong idea of what LDL is, and maybe because everything else got better, maybe it's good for LDL to go up. But it's hard for an old paradigm person like me to believe that, because I've been taught that it's such a bad thing. Well, so you knocked on some doors to find some curious researchers.
I sought to. I tried to go toward the top brass, if you will, the highest luminaries. I wrote to many of them. I'm not going to call them out here, but I'll just say there are some names you and I would know pretty well. I was saying, come on, look, it's not just me. There are many people that exhibit what I like to call the triad, which is not just the high LDL, but as you mentioned, the high HDL, the low triglycerides. You may remember this, but very early on, I had a graphic that was sort of a challenge, and I was trying to keep it friendly. I called it the low-carb cholesterol challenge, because while there was a lot of talk at that time about the small, dense versus big, fluffy, at the end of the day, what showed more commonly with that pattern A, which is the big, fluffy versus pattern B, small, dense, didn't even require an advanced NMR. It really could just look at the existing pattern. If you had high HDL, low triglycerides, you almost always had pattern A. And conversely, the other was already known by a name. It's called atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is having low HDL and high triglycerides. So whatever diet you're on, you typically want to have higher HDL and lower triglycerides. It means that your body is good at managing those lipids on the inside. So that triad of looking not just at the HDL and low triglycerides alongside LDL, I said, hey, this seems to be so commonplace. And indeed, there are many people like myself who have an extreme version of this, not just high LDL, but super high LDL, levels we don't normally see except with some genetic abnormality. And so I started to dub this profile, this phenotype, lean mass hyperresponder. I called them lean mass hyperresponder because they seem to be more commonly people who are leaner, like a BMI of, say, 24 or lower, and their LDL would tend to go higher the leaner they were and the more low carb they were. But this takes me back to the point you were making earlier. This was rare before, but I would argue, Eric, the reason it was so rare before was because leaner, metabolically healthy people weren't that into low carb. They were often told to carb load. They were runners, cyclists. It was anathema to consider a low carb, high fat diet. But as the ketogenic diet became more and more in vogue, and even athletes wanted to try it, well, then all of a sudden, there were more people who were exhibiting this extreme triad, this very high level of LDL, HDL, and triglycerides.
Well, after a minor glitch, we're back telling the story of, I think we were you were checking hour by hour. We saw a graph, how these lipids changed throughout the day and how surprised I was to learn that.
Yeah, there's another graph that really is hour by hour. So those were 6 times over the course of a day. But one thing that I was surprised to find that I didn't realize until maybe 3 years, 4 years into the journey was something I called the triglyceride carryover effect. What I mean by that is it's just sort of assumed that triglycerides go down right away. But as you saw in those graphs, triglycerides will go up, but they kind of go down slowly. And I would argue that the reason for that is because when you're metabolically healthy and on a low-carb diet, there's not as much rapid turnover induced by insulin. So insulin will hack away those fat stores relatively quickly. If you're metabolically healthy and you're on a mixed diet, that includes more carbohydrates, that includes more fiber, things along those lines, they can have an impact on potentially increasing your insulin levels. So here I am now interested in tracking hour by hour because I'm watching the triglyceride levels change. And I call it carryover because I would go to sleep with triglyceride levels that might be, say, in the 200 range, for example. And when I wake up the next day, you can see that they very quickly drop to under 100, sometimes to like, say, 60 by 12 hours fasted. Now, many might say, oh, well, wait a sec. We have an association between triglyceride levels and cardiovascular disease. And after all, I just got done telling you about the triad, right? Which associates a high HDL with the low triglycerides. But I think you and I are very keen on emphasizing this. These are fasted tests.
Yeah.
It's extremely important to recognize why there's a difference between a fasted level and a non-fasted level. The biggest thing is, if you fasted, whether you're on a mixed diet or not, if you've spent 12 hours not consuming food, then that is the one time where we kind of expect all of your fuel in the bloodstream will have been packed away. that suggests that your body has a good metabolism that's being very effective in packing it away. But the difference between fat and glucose is the body acts on glucose to hold it to that tighter delta, that range. There's more endocrine action, more hormonal action, between glucagon and insulin to try to hold it there, right? With fat, there's just less that it acts on. I think that's because that's the state in which when we're fasted, it is not as pathogenic. The range by which fat can be up and down is not as pathogenic. Now, don't get me wrong, if it's like your triglycerides are at very high levels postprandial, probably there were very high levels when you were fasted anyway, which means that there's probably a dysregulation.
I'm sorry to interrupt. When you're talking to other physicians, other researchers, is anyone curious? Yeah, are you? I remember talking to my lipid specialist here at Duke, and years ago, and his first response was, "No, it's cholesterol and fat raises the triglyceride level," and I said, "No, I think that it's carbs that raise the triglyceride level too, at least." And he went to the library and found that I think there were 6 people or 10 people in this study by Ahrens years ago that basically showed both high fat and high carb led to high triglyceride levels, and that low carb would lower the triglyceride levels. And he hadn't remembered that or hadn't been reinforced enough because everyone was just focusing saturated fat's bad, saturated fat's bad. And I remember he was kind of shocked and a little embarrassed that he had only focused on the fat, because he was our local, even well-known lipidologist. So when you're doing physiology and thinking about these things, are you getting some, curiosity and people helping you figure this out?
More and more, but in the very beginning, it was very difficult. And to be fair, I am an engineer, so they're hearing me report data to them that they're used to seeing in an article in a journal, but they're not going to take it quite as seriously because I'm not somebody who's gotten it published in peer review. So this is my way of trying to give them, a little bit of leeway, I guess you can say. But all of that said, as this phenomenon came more and more prominent, as certainly you and many other low-carb physicians would see this triad, would see this combination more and more frequently. And here's the elephant in the room. These aren't just metabolically healthy people who were just trying out keto. This also included a number of people for which there was special efficacy. They had some kind of disease state, such as epilepsy or type 1 diabetes, or my good friend and colleague Nick Norwitz, he has a severe ulcerative colitis, which there would be a particular reason, even though they were metabolically healthy, they had a particular reason to use a ketogenic diet to treat their disease state. They're the ones who we should absolutely be getting this research for, to find out if indeed it is higher risk, because they tend to have the highest levels of LDL because they usually are the ones who are very adherent to keeping truly low carb.
Well said. And the doctors still respond, in my area anyway, with, okay, you cured your ulcerative colitis, you reversed it. Can't cure it, they say. I think you can if you don't go back to eating that way. But they'll even say, well, but you got to get off that unhealthy diet, when it just reversed your serious medical condition. And what? You use a medication that has all these other side effects. And so I wonder if I've become more and more thinking that medical care today is medication care. Most doctors aren't really taught about diet or know what to say about it, but they can reach for medicine pretty quickly. How many times have you been told that you ought to be on a statin medicine for your LDL?
I mean, quite frequently. There's
Probably on
one of the
Twitter or
yeah. Well, and here's one of the fascinating aspects to this is that I think I've stated this many times over. I'll state it here as well. I think it's good to be a scientist and express uncertainty where we really do have uncertainty and say, hey, we don't know. Let's go get it. Let's go get these data. And I realize I haven't shared this part yet, but for those watching who don't know, that's literally what I did. I started the Citizen Science Foundation in 2019. It's a scientific public charity because after trying to get a lot of lipidologists and cardiologists to help get funding together, get a study going and failing, I said, what the heck? Let's see if I can just raise the money from the community, particularly the low carb community. And I had no idea if it would work. I really didn't. But props to the low carb community. It did. We raised the money we needed to, and we're just literally right now, we're completing publication on these lean mass hyperresponders with data of CT angiograms, which are, of course, heart scan data, literally is looking at soft plaque at a very high resolution to see if indeed that they're going to have a higher presence of plaque and a higher progression of plaque because it's a longitudinal study. We're getting 2 scans per participant.
Yeah. So what led you to the study protocol and so the question is, what happens to people who have high LDLs and the high HDLs? And you made a pretty, in fact, several of my patients applied to be in the study, but they didn't meet the specific criteria. The high HDL, the low triglyceride, the high LDL. How did you find the scientists to help you? I have to say, Dr. Budoff is one of the world's leading CT angiographers, and that how did you get interest, or was it really just a matter of having the money and having
it's more the latter than the former. But yeah, so once you've got money together and it's clear that you can pay a research center to actually study this, then that's one of the first steps.
Well, but a key factor is that he is sort of agnostic in terms of belief of LDL, right? I mean,
right.
You would have to find someone who isn't ethically conflicted because he might be, saying that LDL in this certain circumstance isn't harmful. So, and it turns out, I think Dr. Budoff is a good sort of, he'll study things that, he's more interested in the science than the politics or the money behind a drug. Is that your impression?
Well, this was, to be fair, anybody who's researching at high levels with CTs, for example, they almost certainly have a client list that includes pharmacological interventions. So there was no way we were ever going to find somebody who didn't in that regard. But here's the thing about Dr. Budoff that gave me a lot of confidence. One, he has come to findings that were considered controversial within his field. So, for example, there's some recent EPA studies that there's a huge amount of pushback that EPA could be of this enormous benefit instead of cholesterol-lowering medications, even though this isn't the claim that's being made by Dr. Budoff and others. It's just that EPA does show such strong efficacy. I suspect, by the way, that this is because there's just greater deficiency for those people who don't have EPA via diet, but we'll set that aside for now. But there was another thing that I appreciated about Dr. Budoff, which was that the Lundquist Institute, which is his research facility that we're ultimately doing this partnership with, they've also published negative findings. So it really does suggest that he just takes it where the data goes. Something else that I think is also important is there really is a sort of a different beast to CT researchers in that they are more interested in the outcome than they are in the narrative of the outcome. So there really is a genuine excitement of, hey, let's just see what the data tells us, right, at the end of the day. And I feel like Dr. Butoff has seemed to have shown that quite a bit in the research thus far.
So fast forwarding, I know, but now you have 80 to 100 people who were flown to the Lundquist Institute to get a CT angiogram, which is not just the calcium score. It's actually looking at the artery itself. And the initial baseline data were presented at a meeting last fall and in an abstract published just a few weeks ago. And then the idea of the study, though, is to follow these people for a year, get a repeat scan, and then to compare in those individuals whether there was a change. One of the strengths, I think, is over this year, you're going to be actually making people check labs or it's not just self-reported being on a keto diet, right? That the baseline data is really kind of just self-reported, people being on the diet. Will there be some documentation of what they're eating or metabolism?
So, yes, let me describe the design of the study. We're recruiting a total of 100 of these folks. They're lean mass hyperresponders and borderline lean mass hyperresponders. Here's the cut points for everybody. The LDL needs to be 190 or higher, HDL of 60 or higher, and triglycerides of 80 or lower. And importantly, you have to show to us that your new LDL cholesterol level after going on a ketogenic diet was very different before. It had to have increased by 50% or more, and you had to have had an LDL of 160 or less, combined with the increase of 50% or more. So if you went from, say, an LDL of 150 to 200, even though that hits the low and high cut points, it's still not an increase of at least 50%. So that kind of gives you a sense.
Why do that?
Because we wanted to show that there was at least enough of a hyper response that we could confirm, first of all, that they likely did not have a genetic disposition towards higher LDL to begin with, and therefore they were hyper responders per se. Now, some participants didn't make it, not because from their understanding they didn't have those lipid levels that I just mentioned to you now, but sometimes they just couldn't get access to their blood work. They had to prove to us that they did have that by verifiable blood work. But moreover, we also had other cardiovascular risk factors that they couldn't have had, such as a prior diagnosis of cardiovascular disease, a prior diagnosis of severe hypertension, a number of these different components. And a lot of that is so that it could also pass IRB review and so that we could get the study approved. It's worth emphasizing, though, all of these are supposed to be pretty much irrelevant because it's thought, per the existing lipid hypothesis, that high LDL alone will drive the presentation and progression of plaque in the coronary arteries very rapidly. And that's what it's thought for example, children born with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, is they tend to develop cardiovascular disease very quickly alongside their high LDL. And that's why it's been thought this whole time that that's the case. So here we have this one corollary where there's not this genetic abnormality that impairs the metabolism of lipids, but maybe, this is the hypothesis, maybe that lean mass hyperresponders have a functional lipid metabolism, that this actually is physiological. But that's a controversial statement I'm making right now. But that's what I want to check.
I was struck by, I don't think it's common knowledge that the first kind of index case, the little girl who had familial hyperlipidemia, she started getting manifestations of atherosclerosis when she was very young, right?
Yeah.
Like
age
3. Age 3.
Yeah.
So the idea, if the LDL is super high and driving all this, that you would have clinical symptoms by 3 years old.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, they would point out, if memory serves, her LDL was, I want to say 780. So I think many people, to steel man the argument, many people would say, well, that's still much, much higher than most lean mass hyperresponders. But I would want to bring up the point, my good friend and colleague, Nick Norwitz, he's got an LDL of 500. I wouldn't be surprised if you right now have some patients that are in the 500, 600 range, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure, like me, you're giving them all of the warnings, all of the caveats. Hey, this is uncharted territory. You know, we're getting the data, but we don't have the data in hand yet. That said, it's true. I would have thought things characteristic of those children Brown and Goldstein were looking at, such as tendon xanthomas, things along those lines, that we would have seen a higher preponderance of. And you know, unfortunately, things like developing stable angina. And don't get me wrong, this study we're talking about that we're doing, I'm not by any means suggesting I think everybody will be disease-free. There's no such diet. There's no such population that's immune from atherosclerosis. The question is, will they develop it at a rapid level that seems different than another population that might be comparable? And that's what the most recent published paper was that we were looking at them compared to another study called Miami Heart.
Yeah, that was I think a brilliant addition to, you have the baseline data from the study that'll go on for a year, and then the repeat angiogram. But at the baseline, you compared it to a cohort who had the same test but were healthy, and it just happened to be in Miami. That's why it's called the Miami Heart Study. And if you look side by side on the figure, it looks like they had a similar amount of relatively minor coronary atherosclerosis. Like the high was 13 or 15 on a scale of 0 to 45, if my memory serves. So that the point there is that at baseline, it wasn't any different than another relatively healthy population, right?
Yeah, I should set this up a little bit. Basically, as you mentioned, we had our baseline scan. So I said that there's going to be 2 scans per participant. At the time this analysis we're describing, which is a separate analysis, was being done, we took all 100 baseline scans of our group, our cohort, looked at Miami Heart, and by we, I mean the statistician inside of Lundquist. I'm blinded from the data. But the 100 here, it turned out 80 of the 100 were within the age range of Miami Heart.
I see.
So she took the 80 that were within the age range, and then from the pool of 2,400 people, 2,400 participants in Miami Heart, found as much as she could the tightest match between the two groups. And this is what's called a match control. And I myself, I love match controls. I like them more than doing multivariate analysis with control groups, though there's pros and cons to both. But these two groups ended up being a very tight match. They had the same age, which was 55.5. They had the same ethnicity. They had the same composition of male to female, which was mostly male, which frankly is going to just be more likely to have a lot more plaque. And they were very similar on cardiovascular disease, or I should say risk factors, even when they didn't qualify as full-blown risk factors. For example, A1C was like 5.4 or 5.5. Blood pressure was optimal, but fairly close. And lastly, there's the key difference between the two. Our group had an average LDL of 272. 272, for people who don't know, this is the top 10% of the top 1% of the general population. We might be getting used to numbers like that, just hearing them in passing in the low-carb community. But outside the low-carb community, you often will hear general practitioners tell people who are coming into the lean mass hyperresponder groups, this is the highest LDL I've ever seen.
We had a brief technical glitch that maybe lasted a few weeks, but we're back. And after reviewing, your background and the lean mass hyperresponder study baseline data, which is fascinating, that full study will have a replication at a year, and hopefully it will go on further. But what's the next step for the studies on cholesterol? And then we got to go back and talk about how you drove down your LDL by eating more fat. That blows my mind. But how about wrapping up on the LDL elevation?
Yeah, well, definitely on the research front with the Citizen Science Foundation. We just had a conference in March, and I haven't officially broken the news yet, but I'll just share with you here on the podcast because it'll probably be public by then. We're already going to be doing a second conference, COSI, which is short for Collaborative Science Conference, which is pretty much just a giant charity event to raise money for the Citizen Science Foundation for the purposes of doing this research. We already completed this original study, and even though we don't have everything published yet, that's in the analysis stages right now. But the money we're raising currently is for a new study, which our code name for right now is the Triad study. And it's going to be similar to the current one, except with a few notable differences. One, we're going to have an attached control group. Two, it'll be a bit more permissive in its eligibility criteria. So the current one, for example, had HDL of 60 or higher and triglycerides of 80 or lower. Don't quote me on this just yet, but for example, we may actually have different, more common markers of like modestly lower HDL, modestly higher triglycerides, and possibly other cardiovascular risk factors that we were a bit stricter on before. But as you know, we already knew it'd be a challenge to get this through IRB with the initial study.
Right.
And the difference is that now we'll have existing data that suggests, I think we can make the case that this is not as high a risk group as would be a thought of before, which will allow us to get a larger criteria that will probably encompass more of a generalizable audience.
Well, it would make sense to, if things looked good, that, in the first study to expand the criteria a bit, that would make sense from, I think, safety and IRB standpoint. Hopefully the one you use will see it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exciting because I think we're also proving something, Eric, that's super important, which is we're proving there's not just two places in town where you can get your research done, which is either through the government or through some kind of attached business model, such as a pharmaceutical or a drug testing device or a supplement or something along those lines, that hopefully many people can do what we've done here, which is to just go out there and ask and get, crowd funding to get this research accomplished. That's what I'm really proud of, is that we've been able to do this through individuals and make this thing reality.
Been incredible to watch, and thanks to your persistence and the advent of the ability to fundraise directly in $5 and $10 increments or whatever the most common amount was. That is a different model. In some ways, though, it's kind of discouraging and upsetting and depressing that you have to go out and raise your own money to do a study. But I bet once you do it, then other people will start doing it, and suddenly, and of course they'll take credit for it. Just be ready for that. But that's just the way it goes. Anyway, when is the next conference coming up? Will it be an annual thing?
We're hoping it will be. There'll definitely at least be a second one. We're in the process of getting it negotiated, but I believe it's going to be the first weekend of February. I so don't want to get the dates wrong, but I think February 7th through 9th. And
that'll be in Las Vegas again?
It'll be in Las Vegas. I can't announce the location yet, but we're probably going to put out a save the date pretty soon. And it's going to be great because the last one was, as I like to say, more successful than we had any reason for it to be, because we announced it literally 2.5 months beforehand. So a lot of people told me they couldn't make it because it's not enough notice. But yet we still had 300 people show up, and we still managed to raise $67,000, which, as you know, it's hard to raise money with conferences. They're usually a labor of love, and God bless everybody who puts them on. but we did on a shoestring budget. We got everyone to contribute their time and their dime, which includes even the speakers. They came themselves via their own travel, and all of our time was volunteer. It was all for the cause. It was all to take that money and then put it into this new triad study. And again, we're showing that it can be done.
I'm already envisioning the David and Goliath kind of cartoons. Dave, you're David, not Goliath.
Yeah.
Well, so again, can we spend just a moment? This may seem like old history, old hat, but I remember you started, testing yourself and looking at lipid levels every few hours, an hour, and then the next thing I hear is that you figured out a way to lower your LDL cholesterol, and then that you were going to replicate it at a keto conference among people who would come and tell me this story. Again, it blows my mind.
Yeah, well, you were there. This was 2017. It was 2 years into my writing this blog called cholesterolcode.com, and only, as you know, the small number of geeks who were just into this component of hyper responders for those going on a ketogenic diet were actually able to find this blog and chat back and forth with me. And I was kind of known at the time, still kind of am, for doing very intensive N-of-1 experiments. I wanted to capture my blood work in real time. And one of the first things that I identified that associates back to this lipid energy model is something a bit unintuitive, that actually, while in a ketogenic context, so I'm fully fat adapted, my carbohydrate levels are really low, that the first thing I noticed was that if I ate less and less and less, then my cholesterol would go higher, which seems unintuitive because you would think if I'm eating less fat and therefore less saturated fat, well, if that's driving the higher cholesterol, then my cholesterol should go down. But it wasn't. Right. It was going up. And so naturally I thought, well, what if I head the other direction? What if I overconsume my ketogenic diet on purpose and, again, track the cholesterol levels in real time? And sure enough, it showed that it went further down from my baseline levels. And so then I really stepped on the gas and really consumed a lot in just a few days' time. And I found I could drive my LDL cholesterol levels to super low levels. And
but remember, we've been teaching and you've been learning that the more cholesterol you eat, the higher your cholesterol will go, right?
That's right.
And you're finding the exact opposite in yourself.
Yes. But another thing is, at that time, and probably to some degree right now outside of the low-carb community, cholesterol levels are thought to be more glacial, that they're very static, and that really genetics are the primary driver as to where your cholesterol levels are at. And if you want to change them, it's probably going to take some form of medication or a very, very severe dietary change. But even then, the major dietary change, hey, you should celebrate having, like, say, a change of 15 milligrams per deciliter or 20, something along those lines. And here I am, I'm seeing that I can shift it by as much as even 50 or even 100 milligrams per deciliter in a matter of days. It was something I couldn't believe because of how much I kept reading about in the literature, and something that got exciting enough to where a number of people reading my blog would replicate this themselves and report back the data to me. So sure enough, as you know, there was the two keto dudes at the time who were holding their own conference, and this was in the summer of 2017. And we organized an experiment at that time, which we managed to get 24 people to participate in. And ultimately, these 22 individuals would do exactly what I just described. They would overconsume their ketogenic diet through KetoFest. We would get the blood work at the beginning of the conference, which was Friday morning, and then again at the very end, which was Monday morning, and then report back the results. And sure enough, of the 22, 19 saw their LDL cholesterol plummet.
And how much were they consuming?
Well, they each tracked it for themselves, but they were often consuming fatty meats like steaks, Some were consuming huge amounts of salmon. My good friend and colleague, Siobhan Huggins, was downing a whole lot of heavy whipping cream. But why these levels drop, we would better understand years later. But even at that time...
But can't get there yet.
Okay,
So
can't get there yet.
Just to reiterate, just to unpack this, so that people were eating more and more fat and more cholesterol in the diet. And how many calories a day was this? It was...
I think many would say it was double whatever their maintenance level of calories are, because obviously...
Hypercaloric, if anything, the LDL and total cholesterol should go way up based on traditional teaching. Right?
Correct.
Of course, it's in the context of a low-carb keto diet. Always have to say that, but still, the fact that then, so your own Adam 1 was basically 19 out of the 22, so just about everyone had a replication that they could lower their LDL by eating more fat.
That's correct. Now,
I just wanted to repeat that for people because it's really by fast. And it's like the man bites dog story. You don't expect a man to bite a dog. You expect the LDL to go down. So, but then you were for a while saying if an insurance company was going to give you a hassle for a high LDL, then try this and get your insurance on to kind of game the system, or to because the system discriminates against people with high LDLs?
It absolutely does, and actually, it's getting more pervasive. For example, pilots can have their license taken away in some contexts if their LDL is considered too high.
Does this make sense? Sorry, I didn't know what to say.
I mean, this is where I'm coming from. I think we look. This is why we're doing the research. Right. We need to get, I'm so sorry. One second. This will be an edit point. I need to once again change this focus. Let me go back to the beginning of what I was just saying. So this is why we need to do this research, because up until this point in time, as you've heard me say in many different lectures, we usually are looking at higher LDL in the context of some kind of dysfunction or impairment, some kind of illness. And unfortunately, there's reasons I could point to, which could get a bit technical, and we're not going to go there, as to why they clustered together. Because if there's some metabolic problem, that can be its own reason for why your LDL can be higher. And this isn't to say that LDL has nothing to do with cardiovascular disease. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, can we at least see with people like myself, like my good friend and colleague Nick Norwitz or Adrian Sotomoda, that are high LDL, where it seems to be related to fat trafficking, which is what you can see my lectures on, that indeed is the high risk it's assumed to be by conventional medical zeitgeist today, right? And I suspect we're going to find at a population level it is not, or at least at the risk level is nowhere close to as comparable as it's thought to be.
Well, you even look at a study that takes all of these different risk factors, the Dugani paper, looking prospective study with women, and type 2 diabetes was the highest risk. I mean, 12-fold for first cardiovascular event. And LDL was down, it was like one of the lowest associations, below triglyceride and HDL, below metabolic syndrome, below. So the idea that there may be another way to go about this, we've talked about this, how do they do those cell phones anyway? I mean, I'm still using a phone with a flip phone because that's a LDL. We were talking about LDL back then with the flip phones. I mean, so there may be a new technology or a new understanding or a different way to go about things. And this incessant focus on just one way, I mean, it makes sense to me that it's not going to explain everything.
Well, and it's being applied asymmetrically. So by that same token, could I say, should pilots get their fasting insulin tested? Because I'll bet you hyperinsulinemia will associate a lot more with a risk of cardiovascular disease and a heart attack. right?
But it's not gonna be an acute issue the plane's gonna drop, right? So I mean, that's why they check for alcohol. That's why some people got claimed they were on the Atkins diet and had ketones that made their alcohol level high. Pilots, I mean, they should be measuring blood sugar. Yeah, it makes sure they don't have hypoglycemia, but to measure LDL, but I've often wondered, and I've tried to test among my patients and never really got the feedback. I have met actuaries who work for insurance companies. Back to that point, are insurance companies measuring in their own database to see if LDL is a predictor, or are they taking the advice of the experts? This would be actually a pretty easy thing to resolve if you have an insurance company that has their own data with LDLs and other variables. Have you ever talked to an actuary?
I have, because I thought that they would be probably the best people to approach, since it's assumed that they are just bean counters, right? But there are other considerations that they shared with me as to why it is that they often go with established guidelines.
Guidelines. Oh no.
Yes.
Guidelines.
Yes, because
so they will ignore what they see in front of their own face and go with what the experts.
So I'm not going to call out who they are. I'm just going to say I talked to one of the largest in the world. I'll put it that way. And this literally was not too long ago. I don't want to connect too many dots. But I said this exact thing. I said, look, if I could show you a cohort of people who, for instance, really would like to have life insurance, and we could prove to you that they're at lower cardiovascular risk with data that we have that's emergent, right? But it's against the present guidelines, that actually the present guidelines would say that no, they are indeed at high risk and they're classified as such, even if we've got real world data to suggest otherwise, and that the data is specific, right? Isn't that exactly what you do? And his answer was, he said, look, here's the problem. The problem is we're still liable for anything that we do that could seem suggestive against present medical care. Right?
Very interesting.
If you're saying, this is their position and it makes sense. If they're saying, oh, you know what? We'll go ahead and assure against people with high blood pressure in this particular context, because it turns out, given our own internal data, that they're not as high a risk. And then a lawyer for the family of where somebody does get a heart attack says, hey, my husband was taking action to deal with their blood pressure, and they did in fact have a heart attack. And that heart attack might in fact be an outlier, even be unrelated to the high blood pressure, just to use this hypothetical. It will still make the case that the lawyer could then take the insurance company to suit by saying they're the ones who planted that idea in this person's head, but the guidelines suggest that the high blood pressure was bad.
Well, but I wouldn't
be just using blood pressure as an example.
Could it just be an internal black box that you don't tell other people what your secret formula is, but you use triglyceride and HDL instead of LDL? But anyway, I just thank you for that, sharing that information. The other thing that seemed reasonable to me, like Divers Alert Network, which is an insurance company that insures divers, because often scuba divers can't get insurance. It's here in Durham, North Carolina, and so there might be an LDL Alert Network, or someone who he might insure or some entrepreneur could get an insurance based around the idea that actually these people will live longer. Of course, it's a bit of a gamble, and you need some money. I don't know how you start an insurance company. I once talked to someone who worked for Lloyd's of London, but anyway, it's fascinating to hear that an insurance company might not look at their own data, but take guidelines. Wow.
Well, because that is baked into the pie. It's baked in from their actualization, whatever you want to call it, where they're calculating what the likelihood is that they would be at risk for liability, right? If something is well known enough. And And look, let's get meta here for a second. How crazy is it that what we're still talking about doesn't come down to your defense is the truth? It should.
Right.
Your defense should be, hey, wait a sec. This is an evidence-based position. If we have more and more emergent data that is undeniable that this, and again, I'm not stating this as though I know it's fact yet. Well, let's say that more and more of our studies continue to suggest at a population level, this is a low-risk population, then they should be insured as a low-risk population would be if that's what the data show, right? But if your ultimate pushback on that is, well, there's this larger paradigm of assumption that's based on statistical analysis of what it's thought to be based on models. What do you say to that? It's a tough one.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. I recall a lot of the conversations we've had and through the years, it's starting with that, what are you doing by measuring your blood cholesterol, 6 times a day? Is that what it was on the first cruise? All I remember is I said, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it.
Yeah.
I didn't want to tell you not to. Where do people find your latest information, or where would you like people to focus?
Well, of course, there's the cholesterolcode.com that I mentioned before. I will concede that blog we're using a bit less and less and posting more of the direct research to the more official site, which is the Citizen Science Foundation. You can go to citizensciencefoundation.org. It is a bona fide public charity, so of course, any support is appreciated if you contribute. It is a bona fide 501c3 public charity, so it is tax deductible. And we are raising money for this triad study. So if people can keep an eye on it for updates. It's also, by the way, on Twitter at RealCSF. And I myself am pretty active on Twitter if you're trying to reach out to me, Real Dave Feldman. But outside of that, we, of course, also have Own Your Labs, which is our blood testing service. You can basically order your labs for direct blood work. But also importantly, we have an additional, we've had to put it on pause, but we're about to bring it back. We incentivize people to also share their anonymized blood work for our open data archive, which we hope to have released pretty soon.
Yeah, I would love to see. So ownyourlabs.com is a place where you can order the lab, go to LabCorp, I think, have it drawn, and then insurance or other people can't see the labs. And then you can say what diet you're self-describing that you follow. Be very interesting to see a few of these labs compared, carnivore versus carb eater or keto versus carb eater. Blood ketones is different. It's abnormal, to have blood ketones if you're not a carb eater. And we know that that's not unhealthy if you're not a carb eater. But anyway, so I would love to see an assembly. How many people now have put in their information to the ownyourlabs.com?
Well, it's interesting. Coming up until December, I want to say it's probably, I'm just guesstimating, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 5,000, something in the neighborhood. Now, since December, there have been 5,000 or more, something like that, people who've used Own Your Labs. We're growing really rapidly, so thanks again to everybody for their support. However, sorry about that. We're growing very rapidly. Again, thanks to everyone for their support. However, the thing that we needed to work out, we had some things we had to work out with LabCorp for the next steps. And so we had to pause that part of our model until hopefully this coming month. And then hopefully we can bring it back online again, because that's really what drove us to want to do this in the first place. I mean, yes, we love that we're very competitively priced, as you probably well know, for people to be able to get their labs this way, but it's also a way for them to contribute directly to citizen science with their own data. And as you also know, there's very little open and available data sets for people on a low carb diet. We want to make that available. We want the people to be able to do both formal and citizen researchers alike to be able to start doing analyses, to be able to gauge exactly what you were just bringing up. Things like how much are the labs different between a carnivore and somebody on keto versus somebody on a mixed diet, for example. We pick up that demographic information. How much does BMI associate with LDL as verified by what they give us in the demographic information compared to their blood work? And this time it won't be as much like a survey, in that this time it'll be more accountable based on what kind of lipids they get, including advanced ones like NMR, for example.
Fantastic. Now, we were talking a moment ago, how long did it take for this LMHR study, which is now in abstract form published? How long was this from thinking about it to knocking on doors to rating your own?
Yeah, 7 years if you count. Look, the moment I wrote, gosh, it was literally 7 years ago this month. It was July. I wrote that article that identified the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. And when I wrote it, I didn't really know how prominent it actually was. I just kept seeing the pattern because people were sharing it back and forth, sharing their labs back and forth with me. And I kept seeing the pattern. It made sense with the energy model. But for 2 years, you probably already know this, but not a lot of people do. For 2 years, from 2017 to 2019, I kept writing emails to prominent lipidologists that I was finding. I kept, pinging them on Twitter any way I could to try to get them interested in this phenotype. And it wasn't until 2019 that I founded the Citizen Science Foundation and said, let's just do this ourselves. And I kept thinking that, maybe a year and a half away, maybe 2 years away, all throughout this process. But as you know, research takes a lot longer than is often hoped for. But we're here. We're here.
Isn't there a saying that the overnight business success is really 10 years old?
Yes.
So
it's a good way.
I think this is true in every part of the world that is really going to change something. So thank you for your persistence, and thanks for taking time to talk about some really important research that you started. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.